What happens when the most powerful navy in the world, armed with superior technology, sails directly into a trap it cannot see? This is the story of the Battle of Kula Gulf, a brutal midnight engagement where American forces, supremely confident in their all-seeing radar, were systematically dismantled by a silent, invisible killer they refused to believe existed. In this video, we will uncover the shameful intelligence failure that allowed a 10,000-ton American cruiser to be torn in half in less than 2 minutes, sparking a night of horrific chaos and confusion. You'll witness the story of a Japanese victory so perfect it cost them their winning ship and commander, and a tale of survival so desperate it defied belief. The full, shocking story of this fail arrogance and tactical genius awaits. Before we dive into the dark waters of the slot, make sure you are subscribed and have hit the notification bell so you don't miss our deep dives into military history. And if you appreciate learning about these brutal but important lessons, show your support with a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's set the stage for a battle where seeing the enemy first was a death sentence. The map was a living thing, a sprawling organism of green islands and blue channels that seemed to sweat under the single unshaded light bulb. For the planners in Admiral Halsey's headquarters in mid-1943, it was more than paper and ink. It was a vast and humid strategic headache. The ghost of Guadalcanal still lingered in the air. A victory, yes, but one paid for with a currency of exhaustion, steel, and young lives. That brutal education had taught them a fundamental truth of the Pacific War. Islands were not just territory, they were unsinkable aircraft carriers. And the most dangerous of these carriers, the one that currently threatened to unhinge the entire Allied advance in the Solomon Islands, was a tiny smudge of land on the island of New Georgia called Munda Point. The grand design was known as Operation Cartwheel. It wasn't a single thunderous blow, but a complex piece of clockwork, a two-pronged pincer movement designed by minds in both the South and Southwest Pacific areas. The goal was biblical in its ambition, to encircle and ultimately neutralize the Japanese fortress of Rabaul. General MacArthur's forces would creep up the spine of New Guinea, while Admiral Halsey's forces would leapfrog up the Solomon chain. But Munda Point was the gear upon which this part of the machine turned. The Japanese had carved a formidable airfield from its coral landscape, a dagger aimed perpetually at the Allied presence on Guadalcanal and the critical sea lanes between. From Munda, Zeros could rise to challenge American bombers, and Betty bombers could stage their nocturnal raids. To advance, to move the entire Allied front line one step closer to Tokyo, Munda had to be taken. There was no alternative. It was an imperative. This wasn't just a matter of planting a flag. Taking Munda meant launching one of the most complex amphibious operations yet attempted. It meant landing thousands of men not on a single beach, but across a constellation of nearby islands, Rendava, Vangunu, Sasavele, all to create a staging area for the final bloody assault. It was a plan born of necessity, because a direct attack on Munda itself was deemed suicidal. The Japanese defenses were too strong, the coral reefs too treacherous. So the Americans would have to come at it sideways, fighting through miles of primordial jungle that was in itself a third combatant, a foe of sucking mud, malarial mosquitoes, and stifling 100-degree heat that respected no uniform. And through it all, there was the water. The narrow channel, known with grim affection by American sailors as the Slot, was the highway for Japan's most effective lifeline, the Tokyo Express. Night after night, fast-moving Japanese destroyers, sleek greyhounds of the sea, would race down from their northern bases. They were phantoms, slipping through the darkness to deliver fresh troops, ammunition, and food to the beleaguered garrisons, then vanishing before the sun rose. As long as the express ran, the defenders of Munda would never be truly cut off. They could be battered by bombs and shells, but they would not be broken. The planners knew it, the admirals knew it, and every sailor destined for those dark waters felt it in their bones. Before a single Marine could set foot on Munda's coral shores, the Express had to be derailed. The battle for the jungle would first have to be fought, and perhaps won, on the black, unforgiving waters of the Kula Gulf. The silence was the loudest thing. In the pre-dawn gloom of June 30th, 1943, the only sounds were the muffled thrum of engines and the gentle slap of water against the hulls of the landing craft. For the thousands of young Americans crammed into these steel tubs, the world had shrunk to the smell of salt water and the greasy film of diesel and dread. They were the tip of the spear, aimed at Rendova Island, a stepping stone they had to secure before the main event at Munda could even begin. The intelligence had suggested the Japanese garrison was small, perhaps only a few hundred men. But in the suffocating darkness, every rustle of the jungle canopy on the approaching shore sounded like a battalion. The ramps dropped with a deafening crash, a sound that ripped the quiet night apart, and men poured into the warm, waist-deep water. They hit the beach not to the sound of gunfire, but to a bewildering, almost eerie quiet. The surprise was total. For a few precious moments, the landing was a scene of organized chaos. Men struggled to find their units, NCOs bellowed orders that were swallowed by the humidity, and the first jeeps and artillery pieces churned through the wet sand, carving deep ruts in the pristine beach. The Japanese had been caught utterly asleep. But this false dawn of an easy victory lasted less than an hour. The first sign that the hornet's nest had been kicked came not from the jungle in front of them, but from across the blanched channel behind them. A deep guttural roar echoed from Munda Point, followed by a sound that veterans from Guadalcanal knew all too well: the terrifying, ripping canvas noise of heavy shells tearing through the air. The 140mm coastal defense guns, invisible and untouchable miles away, had woken up. Geysers of sand and water erupted among the landing craft, flipping one over like a child's toy. The beach, a moment before a scene of triumphant arrival, became a desperate scramble for cover. Just as the men began to dig in, to burrow themselves into the sand like crabs, a new sound joined the chorus of artillery. A high-pitched whining crescendo that grew from a distant buzz to a soul-shaking roar. Heads turned upward. The sky, moments before a placid tropical blue, was suddenly filled with dark specks. A massive wave of Japanese aircraft, Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers and their escorting Zeros, was sweeping in from the north. The siege had truly begun. There was no front line here, no rear echelon. Every man on that beach was a target. Bombs walked across the supply dumps, turning crates of ammunition and fuel into pillars of black, oily smoke. The air crackled with the frantic barking of American anti-aircraft guns, their tracers reaching into the sky like desperate fingers. From airstrips back on the Russell Islands, American P-40 Warhawks and F-4F Wildcats clawed for altitude, slamming into the Japanese formations. The sky was no longer a vast emptiness, but a canvas of chaos, painted with smoke trails, muzzle flashes, and the awful, final spiraling descent of burning planes. By the time the last Japanese aircraft turned for home, the beachhead was secured, but it was a wounded, bleeding thing. The surprise was gone, replaced by the grim certainty that every inch of this new ground would be contested from the land, the sea, and most violently, from the sky. The beach was a memory, a bad dream of sand and fire left behind after the first few steps. Ahead was the jungle, and it was not a collection of trees, but a single living entity. It rose from the earth like a solid green wall, and to pass through it was to enter a different world. The brilliant tropical sun vanished, replaced by a dim, filtered green twilight that fell through a canopy so thick it felt like a cathedral roof. The air, already heavy with humidity, became a physical weight, thick with the smell of damp earth and 1,000 years of decay. Sound died in this place. A man could be 10 feet away and disappear completely. For the American GIs pushing inland from their precarious foothold at Nassau Bay, this was a special kind of hell, a silent, claustrophobic world where death had learned to wait patiently. Progress was not measured in miles, but in torturous, sweat-soaked yards. Each step was a battle against sucking mud that grabbed at boots and roots that seemed deliberately placed to trip a man laden with 60 pounds of gear. Creeks and rivers, not on any map, appeared without warning, their brown water hiding whatever lay beneath. The men of the 43rd Infantry Division were learning that the Japanese soldier was only their secondary enemy. The jungle itself was the primary foe, and it was undefeated. From within this green labyrinth, the Japanese fought a war of ghosts. There were no battle lines, no charges across open fields. There was only the sudden, heart-stopping chatter of a Nambu light machine gun from a bunker that nobody had seen. A position so perfectly camouflaged, it seemed to have grown from the earth itself. The Japanese pillboxes were masterpieces of defensive warfare. Deep, interconnected dugouts, covered with layers of logs and earth, impervious to anything short of a direct hit from artillery that was still struggling to get off the beaches. An American patrol would spend hours crawling forward, only to be stopped cold by a single, invisible stream of fire. Taking one required a terrifying calculus of grenades and flamethrowers, a brutal, close-quarters affair that left men shaken and fewer in number. Miles to the north, on the Bobdubi front, the Australian 15th Brigade was engaged in the same gruesome work, though with a grim familiarity born of their experience in New Guinea. These were the diggers, lean and hardened men who understood the jungle's cruelties. Their commander, Colonel Ginn, had devised a complex offensive, a series of flanking maneuvers and encircling movements meant to trap the Japanese defenders against the sea. It was a brilliant plan on paper, a chess master's gambit, but on the ground, it was a nightmare of execution. How do you flank an enemy you can't see? How do you coordinate an attack when radio signals are swallowed by the terrain and runners get lost in a disorienting landscape where every direction looks the same? A single company, tasked with a wide flanking march, would set out at dawn and by noon be utterly lost, their compasses spinning, their sense of direction warped by the suffocating sameness of the jungle. They fought less against the Japanese and more against the crushing despair of being swallowed by the green. At the end of each day, the gains were tallied, a small ridge taken, a trail junction secured. But the cost was always visible in the faces of the survivors, their uniforms black with sweat, their eyes hollow. The jungle did not yield ground. It consumed men, weapons, and time with an insatiable appetite. And as the ground war slowly, painfully ground forward, the real question loomed ever larger. How long could they sustain this fight if the enemy's lifeline, the endless stream of reinforcements from the sea, was not cut? For the men of Imperial Japanese Navy Destroyer Division 10, the war had a rhythm, dictated by the setting of the sun. The blistering daylight hours, spent anchored in the sweltering heat of Rabaul's harbor or the forward base at the Shortland Islands, were a time of tense preparation. The ships themselves, elegant gray predators of the Kagero and Yugumo classes, were stripped of any peacetime comfort. Every spare inch of deck space was piled high, not with naval ordnance, but with the grim necessities of a starving land army. Sacks of rice, often alive with weevils, were stacked next to wooden crates of 7.7mm ammunition and precious boxes of medical quinine. The sailors, wiry and disciplined, worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency, their movements a familiar ballet of sweat and purpose. They knew their ships were among the finest destroyers in the world, thoroughbreds designed for swift, deadly torpedo attacks in the dead of night. But now, they were little more than high-speed cargo haulers, their sacred mission reduced to a desperate nightly delivery run. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, the true nature of their task took shape. On board would clamber hundreds of soldiers of the Imperial Army, fresh-faced replacements or returning veterans, their expressions grim. They were human cargo, crammed onto the very decks where the sailors fought and slept, their presence a constant reminder of the meat grinder on New Georgia they were feeding. The destroyers would slip their moorings, not as a proud battle squadron, but as a line of furtive ghosts. Once clear of the harbor, the captains would push their engines to the limit, and the ships would come alive, a bone-jarring vibration running through their steel plates as they surged south towards the dreaded channel the Americans called the Slot. On the bridge, the mood was electric with tension. The captain, a man who had likely seen action from Pearl Harbor to Midway, would stand for hours without rest, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Every lookout strained to pierce the gloom, searching for the telltale V-shaped wake of an American PT boat or the drone of a PBY Catalina hunting in the dark. The run was a mad dash through a gauntlet. Flares could drop from the sky at any moment, painting them as perfect targets against the black water. But the true genius of the Express was its timing and its audacity. They arrived off the coast of New Georgia in the deepest part of the night, a time when human senses were at their lowest ebb. There was no docking, no careful unloading. The destroyers would slow, turning their broadsides to the shore, becoming terribly vulnerable. On a hushed command, the entire crew would spring into action. The supply crates and sealed metal drums, filled with provisions, were simply kicked over the side, a calculated offering to the tide, which would hopefully carry them ashore for the desperate soldiers to retrieve. The human cargo was unloaded with similar haste, scrambling down nets into swaying barges, or simply leaping into the surf to make their own way to the beach. The entire operation was a frantic race against the coming dawn. They had to be gone, clear of the coast and racing north at flank speed, before the first American fighter planes at Henderson Field began their morning patrols. As the destroyers turned for home, their decks empty and smelling of the Army, a quiet exhaustion would settle over the crew. They had done their duty, they had delivered the goods. And in the jungles of New Georgia, the lifeline for one more night had held. The heat in Purvis Bay, just off the coast of Florida Island, was a physical presence, a wet blanket that smothered the ships at anchor. But aboard the light cruisers of U.S. Navy Task Group 36.1, the air conditioners and the combat information centers hummed with a cool technological confidence. These ships were not the furtive, overloaded transports of the Tokyo Express. They were instruments of annihilation. The USS Helena, USS St. Louis, and the flagship USS Honolulu were magnificent expressions of American industrial might, long, powerful vessels, each bristling with 5 triple turrets of rapid-firing 6-inch guns. They were bruisers, designed to pump out a terrifying volume of steel and high explosives, and the man who commanded them, Rear Admiral Walden L. Pug Ainsworth, believed in them with an almost religious fervor. Ainsworth was a product of the old gun club Navy, a man whose professional world revolved around deflection shooting, shell velocity, and spotting the fall of shot. But he was also a convert to the new religion of radar. For Ainsworth and his officers, night combat was no longer a matter of luck and visual acuity. It was a problem of physics and geometry, to be solved by electronics. The plan, rehearsed endlessly in drills, was a symphony of modern warfare. The SG Surface Search Radar, a squat, spinning bed spring of an antenna, was their all-seeing eye. It would pierce the suffocating blackness of the slot and paint the Japanese ships as faint, ghostly blips on a cathode ray tube deep within the ship's armored citadel. In the darkened CIC, men with headsets would translate those blips into range and bearing, feeding the data into a mechanical marvel of gears and gyros, the fire control computer. Miles away, in the turrets, gun barrels would silently elevate and traverse, guided by this electronic brain. The ships would be tracking, aiming, and ready to fire before a Japanese lookout could ever hope to spot their silhouettes. This was their supreme advantage, the ace up their sleeve. They would hit the enemy with the first salvo, a shocking, radar-guided deluge of shells that would tear the famously thin-skinned Japanese destroyers to pieces before they could even react. It was a clean, elegant, and lethal doctrine. And it bred a dangerous confidence that permeated the entire task group. There was, however, a ghost in their machine, a flaw in their logic that was not written in any training manual. The doctrine was built around the gun. The torpedo, particularly the enemy's torpedo, was a secondary consideration. American intelligence vastly underestimated the capabilities of the Japanese Type 93, the Long Lance. They believed Japanese torpedoes had a range similar to their own unreliable models, perhaps 10,000 yards, a distance at which Ainsworth's cruisers would already be mauling the enemy with their guns. The idea that the Japanese could launch a devastating attack from twice that distance was not just dismissed, it was largely inconceivable. As Task Group 36.1 weighed anchor and steamed out of the relative safety of the bay, forming a protective screen of destroyers around the cruisers, they were the very picture of American power. They were not sneaking, they were hunting. And as they pointed their bows north towards New Georgia, steaming into the setting sun, they were hunters who were utterly, fatally blind to the true length of the tiger's claws. The ship felt different. To the veteran sailors of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the destroyer Niizuki was an entirely new breed of warship. She was an Akizuki-class vessel, larger and more powerfully armed than the older destroyers, but the real difference was not in her guns. It was a strange latticework antenna mounted atop her bridge, an apparatus that rotated with a steady, almost imperceptible hum. This was the Type 22 surface search radar, a piece of technology so new and secret that many in the fleet were not even aware of its existence. It was a crude instrument compared to the sophisticated American sets, its display a confusing dance of green light. But in the absolute blackness of the Solomon Islands night, it was the equivalent of giving sight to a blind man. And tonight, on the evening of July 5th, it was the ace up the sleeve of Rear Admiral Teruo Akiyama. Akiyama, commanding the reinforcement unit from the bridge of the Niizuki, was not just another delivery captain. His was a force divided by purpose, a tactical evolution of the standard Tokyo Express run. Trailing behind his flagship were the workhorses, the destroyers Nagatsuki, Satsuki, and Unagi, their decks crammed with over 1,600 troops and their holds filled with supplies. Their mission was the familiar one, a high-speed dash to Vila Plantation on Columbara, a frantic unloading, and a swift retreat. But Akiyama's own division, a powerful support unit composed of the Niizuki and the destroyers Suzukaze and Tanikaze, had a second, more predatory objective. Their holds were not filled with rice. They were filled with the deadliest naval weapon in the world, the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo. Their mission was not to evade, but to destroy. For weeks, Japanese naval intelligence had noted the increasing aggression of American surface forces. The enemy was getting bolder, pushing their cruisers and destroyers deeper into the slot, confident in their technological superiority. Akiyama was there to challenge that confidence. He was the commander of a trap, using the transport destroyers as bait. His plan was a deadly fusion of old tactics and new technology. The Type 22 radar would be his eyes, allowing him to detect the Americans long before they could spot his force. He would then use the superior speed of his destroyers to maneuver into a perfect firing position on the flank of the enemy column, well outside the effective range of their guns. From that darkness, he would unleash a devastating, coordinated salvo of long lance torpedoes, weapons that ran faster, farther, and with a heavier warhead than anything the Allies possessed. They would strike the American ships without warning, turning their proud cruisers into funeral pyres before they could even fire a retaliatory shot. This was the new doctrine of the night: see first, shoot first with torpedoes, and vanish. As Akiyama's reinforcement unit cleaved through the placid waters of the Bougainville Strait and turned south, the mood on his bridge was not one of apprehension, but of keen, lethal anticipation. He was not merely hoping to avoid the American hunters, he was counting on finding them. Deep in the armored heart of the USS Helena, the world was a circle of cool green light. This was the Combat Information Center, the ship's electronic brain, a place that smelled of ozone and stale coffee. Here, a handful of young men in headsets, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of their consoles, practiced a new and revolutionary kind of warfare. They were the scope dopes, and they were watching God's own view of the Solomon Sea unfold on their planned position indicator scopes. The SG radar provided a stunningly clear picture. The coast of New Georgia was a sharp, solid mass on one side of the screen, Kolombagara a looming shadow on the other. A sweeping line of light rotated around the dial like the hand of a clock, and with every pass, it repainted the world, confirming that the dark water between the islands was, for the moment, empty. This was the American advantage, distilled into a glowing phosphorus image. It was a system of absolute clarity. A contact was not a guess, it was a precise point of light with a range and bearing that could be read instantly. That data was then passed to a sailor at the plotting table, who would mark its position with a grease pencil, tracking its course and speed. From the plot, the information was fed to the gun director. It was a seamless, logical, and devastatingly effective process. It took the guesswork out of night fighting, replacing the fallible human eye with the unerring certainty of microwaves. The men in the CIC were confident and calm. They were not looking for a needle in a haystack. They were waiting for a single, obvious anomaly to appear on their perfect glowing map. They trusted the system completely. It was the American way of war. Problems were identified, technology was applied, and a solution was engineered. Miles to the north, in a cramped, sweltering steel box welded to the back of the Niizuki's bridge, another young man also stared into the dark. But his view was profoundly different. He had no map, no God's eye view. His entire world was a single horizontal green line on a primitive A-scope display. This was the product of the Type 22 radar. It did not paint a picture. When the spinning antenna pointed at something solid, a jagged spike or blip would jump up from the line. The operator's job, a task requiring immense skill and concentration, was to interpret that spike. Was it a ship? Or was it sea return, the radar waves bouncing off the crests of nearby waves? Was it the hard return of a cruiser's hull, or the soft, ambiguous echo of a rain squall? The Japanese system was not a map, it was a cryptic message from the ether. It was a pointer, not a picture. Its purpose was to give Admiral Akiyama a single, vital clue. The enemy is out there, in that direction, at that approximate range. The rest would be up to the legendary night vision of his lookouts and the unparalleled skill of his torpedo crews. As the two forces steamed toward one another, they were both blind, yet both could see. One side trusted in a perfect, comprehensive system. The other put its faith in a fleeting, ambiguous glimpse, a single spike of light that could mean everything or nothing at all. It lay silent in the oily darkness of its tube, a beast of polished steel and latent chemical fury. To the torpedo crews of the destroyer Suzakaze, it was not merely a weapon, it was an object of reverence, the culmination of 2 decades of obsessive, dangerous innovation. Nearly 30 feet long and 24 inches in diameter, the Type 93 torpedo was a monster, far larger and more powerful than any other torpedo in the world. But its size was not its most terrifying secret. Its secret was what it breathed. Where American and British torpedoes were propelled by compressed air, a mixture that was mostly inert nitrogen, the Type 93 was fed a diet of pure, volatile oxygen. This was a breathtakingly dangerous technological gamble. Pure oxygen is notoriously difficult to handle, prone to catastrophic explosion at the slightest impurity. But Japanese naval engineers, through years of painstaking and often fatal experimentation, had harnessed this demon. The result was a weapon that bordered on the supernatural. By burning its fuel with pure oxygen, the Type 93's engine was vastly more efficient, leaving no telltale trail of exhaust bubbles to betray its path. It was a truly wakeless weapon, an invisible killer in the night sea. This same efficiency gave it a range and speed that Allied commanders would have dismissed as pure fantasy. The Long Lance, as the Americans would later nickname it with grudging awe, could travel an astonishing 22,000 yards, over 11 nautical miles, at a blistering 48 knots. No American cruisers' guns could hope to reach a target that far away. The Japanese destroyers could stand off in the darkness, completely outside the effective range of Admiral Ainsworth's vaunted artillery, and launch a decisive attack. And what an attack it was! The warhead of the Type 93 carried over 1,000 pounds of powerful Type 97 explosive, a payload capable of breaking the back of a cruiser with a single devastating blow. The Japanese Navy had built its entire night fighting doctrine around this weapon. They were not brawlers who stood and traded shell for shell. They were assassins. Their torpedo specialists, the Reige Kisen, were the elite of the fleet, men who had drilled relentlessly in the art of the massed torpedo salvo. They practiced until they could compute firing solutions for multiple targets in the chaos of a night action, launching their deadly fish in perfectly timed overlapping spreads. As the ships of the reinforcement unit sliced through the waters of the slot, their greatest power lay dormant within their launch tubes. It was a power the Americans did not understand and could not counter. It was the argument that would settle the coming debate of guns versus torpedoes. An argument that was nearly 30 feet long, weighed 3 tons, and did not leave a wake. The night was absolute. After midnight on July 6th, Kula Gulf was a place that existed only in sound and feeling. The whisper of a warm breeze, the gentle hiss of water along a steel hull, the thrum of turbines felt through the soles of one's shoes. The moon was new, and a high overcast had swallowed the stars. The great volcanic masses of Kolombangara and New Georgia on either side were not visible as islands, but as deeper voids of blackness against the black sky. It was a perfect night for an ambush. It was a perfect night to die. Aboard the USS Honolulu, Admiral Ainsworth's flagship, the ship was a taut drum of controlled, professional tension. The crew had been at general quarters for hours. In the stifling heat of the gun turrets and engine rooms, men sat in silence, sweating, waiting. On the bridge, the only light came from the dim red glow of instruments. Ainsworth was calm, pacing slowly, his faith placed entirely in the cool, quiet room 3 decks below him, the CIC. His cruisers and destroyers were arrayed in a perfect column, a textbook formation for the battle he intended to fight. They were steaming at a steady 18 knots, a hunter's pace, sweeping the dark water ahead. Every few minutes, a disembodied voice would crackle from the speaker. "CIC, bridge. Screen remains clear, Admiral. No contacts." For Ainsworth, this was confirmation that his approach was undetected, that the trap was closing. He was sailing into the exact stretch of water where the Tokyo Express was most likely to be found, at the exact time it was expected. The plan was working perfectly. He was a man of systems and logic, and the logic was telling him that victory was imminent. Miles to the northwest, on the open bridge of the Niizuki, Admiral Akiyama tasted the same humid air, but his methods were different. He was a creature of the night, surrounded by his elite lookouts, men whose eyes, aided by enormous Fujinon binoculars, were considered as vital as any piece of machinery. They were not just looking, they were sensing, feeling for any disturbance in the perfect fabric of the darkness. At a few minutes past 0100, Akiyama's force entered Kula Gulf from the opposite end. For a brief, terrible moment in time, the two fleets were on opposite but converging courses, separated by less than 20 miles of water, utterly invisible and deaf to one another. Two lines of steel, freighted with over 5,000 human lives, were about to intersect. It was in that moment of absolute blindness that the first flicker of sight was granted. In the small, hot radar compartment aboard the Niizuki, a young operator who had been staring at the meaningless static on his A-scope for hours saw it, a tiny, intermittent spike. It was a ghost, a whisper, a single electronic nerve twitching in the dark. He adjusted his gain, his heart pounding. It appeared again, sharper this time. He did not hesitate. The voice tube whistle shrilled on the bridge. Akiyama leaned in. The message was quiet, electrifying, and it changed the world. Radar contact, bearing 107, range approximately 13 miles. On the bridge of the Niizuki, the quiet report from the voice tube landed with the force of a physical blow. Admiral Akiyama did not hesitate. This was the moment for which his entire doctrine had been created. The enemy was exactly where he should be, confident, blind, and steaming in a perfect straight line. Quiet, sharp commands cut through the tension. He ordered his support division to increase speed to 30 knots, turning to port to unmask their torpedo batteries and open the range, bringing his force onto a parallel opposite course to the American column. The transport destroyers were ordered to reverse course and retire at high speed. The bait was now being pulled away, leaving the American hunters with Akiyama's wolves. In the darkness, the Japanese warships heeled over, their engines thrumming with a new, urgent power, their wakes churning the black water into brilliant white foam. On the rocking decks, the Reigekisen crews worked with a speed born of 1,000 drills. The massive torpedo mounts, weighing over 15 tons, trained out, pointing toward the unseen enemy. In the torpedo control stations, officers were making final, frantic calculations based on the sparse data coming from the single radar set. Target angle, speed, torpedo run time. It was an art of deadly estimation. At 0146, with the American ships still completely oblivious to his presence, Akiyama gave the order he had been waiting for. Across his division, 8 Type 93 torpedoes, the pride of the Imperial Navy, slid from their tubes with a hiss of compressed air. They were the first shots of the battle, fired in complete silence and total invisibility. For the next 10 minutes, they would be an unseen wave of death, running at nearly 50 knots toward an enemy that did not know a battle had even begun. It was only at 0148, 2 minutes after the long lances had entered the water, that the superior American SG radar finally earned its keep. In the cool, quiet CIC of the USS Helena, an operator calmly announced, "Radar contact, multiple pips, bearing 315, range 22,000 yards." The information was relayed to Admiral Ainsworth on the bridge of the Honolulu. The news was a jolt of adrenaline. The prey had been found. There was no alarm, only the swift, confident execution of a well-rehearsed plan. Ainsworth immediately ordered a turn to starboard to bring his ships onto the same course as the enemy. And at 0157, he gave the simple, thrilling command: "Commence firing." The night erupted in a man-made volcano of sound and light. The 6-inch guns of Helena, St. Louis, and Honolulu opened fire, spitting massive gouts of orange-white flame. The roar was a physical concussion, and the sky was suddenly crisscrossed with the glowing red lines of tracer shells. Admiral Ainsworth believed he had achieved perfect tactical surprise, that he was about to annihilate an unsuspecting enemy with a devastating radar-guided barrage. He was wrong. The battle had been decided 10 minutes earlier by a volley of weapons he couldn't see, from a range he didn't believe was possible. Far out in the darkness, the first American shells began to land, sending up brilliant white plumes of water around the Japanese destroyers. And in the black water, much, much closer, 8 silent assassins closed the last few hundred yards to their unsuspecting targets. Aboard the USS Helena, the world was a symphony of controlled violence. Every 15 seconds, her 5 triple turrets unleashed a 45-gun broadside, a performance of such concussive power that the deck plates jumped and unshielded light bulbs shattered. The gun crews, stripped to the waist in the sweltering heat, worked in a practiced, sweat-slick rhythm of loading and firing, their faces briefly and repeatedly illuminated by the volcanic flash of their own guns. From the bridge, Captain Cecil watched the distant splashes of their shells, guided by the unerring radar, and felt a surge of professional pride. They had the enemy dead to rights. They were winning. It was in this exact moment of supreme violent confidence at 020 that the first Long Lance arrived. It was not a sound, it was a feeling, a deep, sickening concussion that lifted the entire 10,000-ton cruiser upwards, as if it had been struck from beneath by the fist of a god. The lights went out. The thunderous roar of the guns was replaced by a sudden, unnatural silence, broken only by the horrifying shriek of tortured, tearing steel. Before the crew could even comprehend what had happened, a second torpedo, rumming just behind the first, slammed into the ship's midsection, near the forward engine room. This impact was catastrophic. It detonated the forward magazines in a secondary explosion of such magnitude that the ship's spine snapped. A third torpedo followed a half-second later, hitting the already broken vessel and tearing her apart. The bow of the USS Helena, from the number 1 turret forward, was sheared off completely, tumbling away into the darkness. Inside the dying ship, it was a hell beyond imagination. Men who had been firing guns a moment before were now struggling for their lives in compartments that were instantly flooded with fuel oil and seawater. The total darkness was filled with the screams of the wounded and the roar of high-pressure steam venting from ruptured pipes. The ship was no longer a single vessel, but 2 separate sinking pieces of wreckage, connected only by twisted steel and dying men. From the bridge of the USS St. Louis, steaming just behind the Helena, the sight was unbelievable. One moment, the Helena was a blaze of gunfire, a powerful silhouette against her own muzzle flashes. The next, she erupted in a massive, silent gout of orange and red flame, a fireball that climbed hundreds of feet into the night sky, briefly illuminating the entire scene. On their radar screens, the solid, reassuring blip that was the Helena simply fractured, then vanished. In less than 2 minutes, a modern light cruiser and 1,000 of her crew had been violently erased from existence, struck down by an enemy they never saw, by a weapon they never knew was coming. The first breath was a gasp of fire and fuel oil. For the men thrown into the water by the explosions, consciousness returned not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent immersion into a chaotic liquid hell. The sea, which should have been cool, was warm and thick with the ship's lifeblood, a choking, viscous fluid that stung the eyes and coated the lungs. The world was no longer a solid, predictable deck, but a churning, unstable surface littered with the debris of their former lives. And all around them, the darkness was alive with the most terrible sound of all, the cries of hundreds of their friends, some calling for help, others for their mothers, their voices rising and falling on the gentle swell. This was the immediate inheritance of the Long Lance, a floating community of the damned. Above them, the 2 halves of their ship, the proud USS Helena, were dying in their own separate agonies. The stern section, its propellers somehow still turning under the command of dead men in the engine room, performed a slow circular death waltz for 15 minutes before finally giving up the ghost and sliding beneath the waves. The larger middle section of the hull, where the bridge and forward turrets lay in ruins, remained afloat longer, a temporary and treacherous island of salvation. Men, many of them terribly wounded and burned, clung to its canted decks, trying to cut loose the life rafts that were now tangled in a mess of shattered metal and rigging. Captain Cecil, having been blown from his bridge into the water, swam back to this main section, his authority undiminished by the catastrophe, and began to organize his surviving crew with a calm, steady voice that cut through the panic. But this was happening in the middle of a still raging battle. The survivors' ordeal was punctuated by the scream of 6-inch shells from the other American cruisers still firing blindly at the distant Japanese destroyers. Tracers from both sides drew lazy, deadly red arcs in the sky high above them. They were adrift in a naval no-man's land, their survival a matter of complete indifference to the ongoing contest of steel. A quarter-mile away, the ship's severed bow floated like a tombstone, a separate, ghostly island of wreckage with its own small clutch of stunned survivors. At 0227, the main section of the Helena finally gave up its fight against the sea. With a final, protesting groan of twisting bulkheads, the last island of steel was gone, slipping beneath the surface and leaving a great, sucking vortex in its wake. All that was left were the men, hundreds of them, alone in the dark, clinging to rafts and wreckage, their faces turned toward the other American ships, praying for a rescue that, for now, could not come. On the bridge of the USS Honolulu, the stunning flash of the Helena's demise was followed by an even more stunning silence from the voice tubes and radio circuits. One moment, the lead cruiser was the third ship in Admiral Ainsworth's powerful column. The next, she was a void on the radar screen and a towering pillar of flame in the night. The Admiral's mind, trained in the clear, predictable physics of gunnery, struggled to process an event that defied logic. His ships had achieved perfect radar surprise. They were pouring accurate fire onto a distant enemy. How could the lead ship in his column simply explode? The only possible answer was a torpedo, but that made no sense. There had been no enemy aircraft, no PT boats detected. It was a phantom blow from an impossible range, a devastating tactical problem for which he had no immediate solution. His first duty, however, was not to solve the puzzle, but to save his remaining ships. Fearing another unseen volley of torpedoes was already in the water, Ainsworth gave a series of sharp, urgent commands. He ordered a turn to starboard, then another hard to port, sending his powerful cruisers and their destroyer screen into a series of radical, high-speed, evasive maneuvers. The perfect, disciplined column that had steamed into Kula Gulf hours earlier dissolved into a scattered collection of individual ships, each now fighting its own battle. The cruisers Honolulu and St. Louis continued to fire their main batteries, but the disciplined, concentrated barrage was gone. Now they fired sporadically at fleeting muzzle flashes in the distance, lashing out blindly at an enemy whose position was now a complete mystery. On the Japanese side, Admiral Akiyama had watched the distant fireball with grim satisfaction. His torpedoes had struck a major blow. But his victory was immediately complicated by the furious and surprisingly accurate return fire from the American cruisers. Shells straddled his flagship, the Niizuki, and at least one 6-inch round found its mark, killing his veteran chief petty officer, smashing the delicate Type 22 radar set, and sending shrapnel across the bridge that wounded Akiyama himself. His single, decisive advantage, his eyes in the dark, was now gone. With his primary mission of protecting the transports paramount and his flagship damaged, Akiyama made a commander's decision. He would not press his luck. He ordered his ships to make smoke and retire to the north to cover the withdrawal of the transport group. The initial, perfectly executed ambush had now devolved into a swirling, confused melee. The battle lines had vanished. As the Niizuki limped away, American destroyers, now operating on their own initiative, gave chase, their radar still tracking the damaged vessel. The Admiral's grand battle had shattered into a dozen smaller, desperate fights across a dark and unforgiving sea. For the men in the water, the receding thunder of the gun battle was a double-edged sword. The immediate terror of being caught in a crossfire had passed, but it was replaced by a deeper, colder dread, the fear of being forgotten. They were a scattered flock of human misery, hundreds of men bobbing in an oily sea, miles inside enemy-controlled territory. The battle and the fleet had moved on, leaving them alone with the cries of the wounded in the vast, indifferent darkness. Hope was beginning to curdle into despair when a new sound reached them. Not the terrifying scream of shells, but the steady, welcome thrum of friendly engines. Out of the gloom, the lean silhouette of an American destroyer emerged, approaching slowly, cautiously. On the bridge of the USS Radford, Lieutenant Commander William K. Romasser faced the most difficult decision of his career. His orders were to pursue and destroy the enemy. His tactical sense screamed that to stop his ship, to go dead in the water in a battle zone where enemy torpedoes were known to be lurking, was an act of suicide. But through his binoculars, he could see the bobbing pinpricks of light from the survivors' life jackets, and he could hear their faint calls for help across the water. The choice was between the mission and his men. Not his own men, but his brothers in the Navy. It was no choice at all. He gave the order to stop engines. A few minutes later, the destroyer USS Nicholas arrived and, seeing the Radford's intent, made the same courageous gamble. What followed was an act of desperate, disciplined mercy. The destroyers, now helpless, stationary targets, became islands of salvation. Cargo nets were slung over their sides, and their crews lined the rails, reaching down to grab the oil-slicked hands of the survivors. It was grueling, heartbreaking work. The men from the Helena were exhausted, many were wounded or badly burned, and all were coated in a thick, slippery layer of fuel oil that made gripping them nearly impossible. While sailors on deck performed these acts of gentle heroism, the rest of the crew waged a silent, paranoid war against the surrounding darkness. Lookouts scanned the horizon for the telltale wake of an approaching torpedo. Sonar men listened intently for the hum of a submarine, and gun crews stood ready at their mounts, peering into a night that still felt full of menace. Every man pulled from the sea was a small victory, but every second spent stationary was a roll of the dice with disaster. As the first hints of dawn began to gray the eastern sky, the destroyers had pulled over 750 men from the water, but they knew many were still missing. Some adrift on rafts, and others clinging to the ghostly, severed bow that had floated away. With the imminent threat of Japanese air attack, the destroyers could not linger. Their decks crowded with the living ghosts of the Helena, they slowly got underway, leaving the dark waters of Kula Gulf to whatever fate awaited the men they had been forced to leave behind. As the Niizuki steamed north, the sharp sting of adrenaline on her bridge was replaced by the metallic scent of damage and the quiet groans of the wounded. Admiral Akiyama, his own injury hastily bandaged, stared into the darkness his ship could no longer electronically pierce. The shattered radar antenna was a useless wreck, a blind eye that had paid for its brief, brilliant moment of vision with its own destruction. He had seen the magnificent, terrible bloom of flame on the horizon and knew his torpedoes had crippled the American force. But the price for that knowledge had been a brutal, close-range gun duel his ship was never designed to endure. He had won the exchange, he was sure of it, and now his duty was to shepherd his victorious but wounded flock home. But the Americans were not done. The destroyers USS Nicholas and Radford, having detached from Ainsworth's main body, were guided by their own superior radar, and they were hunting. They found the limping Niizuki alone in the dark. The ship that had seen so perfectly was now blind, cornered, and bleeding. A new, vicious battle erupted. The American destroyers, products of a nation that could build them by the dozen, unleashed a relentless torrent of 5-inch shells. The Niizuki, Japan's newest and most advanced destroyer, was simply overwhelmed. Riddled by shell fire and struck by at least one American torpedo, she lost power and began to settle in the water, her guns firing defiantly until the sea silenced them. At 0300, the pride of the reinforcement unit capsized and sank, taking with her Admiral Akiyama and the vast majority of his crew. The hunter had become the hunted, and the victor had not survived to see the dawn. In the cold, objective light of morning, the results of the night's savage work could be tallied. From the Japanese perspective, the mission was a stunning success. While Akiyama's support force had fought and perished, the transport destroyers had slipped through the chaos, successfully landed their 1,600 troops and tons of supplies on Columbara, and were now safely steaming back to the Shortlands. The lifeline had not been cut. On the tactical ledger, the trade was brutal, but in their eyes favorable. They had lost the destroyer Niizuki in combat and a second destroyer, the Nagatsuki, which ran aground during the unloading and had to be abandoned. The price was 2 destroyers and a fine admiral. In exchange, they had sunk a powerful American light cruiser. It was a textbook victory in the art of the night torpedo attack, a testament to the skill of their sailors and the supremacy of the Longlands. But it was the kind of victory the Japanese Empire could no longer afford, a successful battle in a war of attrition they were destined to lose. For a rifleman in the 169th Infantry, hunkered down in a waterlogged foxhole near the Munda Trail, the great naval battle in Kula Gulf was nothing more than a faint, percussive rumor that had disturbed his sleep a few nights earlier. His war was not one of fleet-sized maneuvers and technological duels. It was a claustrophobic, intimate struggle measured in grenades and muddy yards. The distant thunder from the sea had been momentarily distracting, but it had not stopped the rain, lessened the swarm of mosquitoes, or silenced the Japanese machine gun nested in the banyan roots 50 yards up the trail. In the days that followed the battle, however, the rifleman and his comrades began to feel its consequences, not as a news report, but as an increase in the pressure against them. The change was subtle, but it was real. The Nambu machine gun that had been firing in short, conservative bursts now chattered with a more confident profligacy. The nightly mortar attacks became more frequent and more accurate. Probing counterattacks, launched from the dark of the jungle, were pressed with a renewed, ferocious determination. The 1,600 fresh, well-supplied soldiers delivered by the Tokyo Express on the night of the battle had been fed directly into the meat grinder. For the Allied troops on the ground, the Japanese tactical victory at sea had translated directly into a harder, bloodier, and more costly fight on land. The lifeline, for a time, had worked, stiffening the resolve of Munda's beleaguered garrison and making the Allied advance even more of an agonizing crawl. But a single, successful delivery run, however brilliant, could not stop the inexorable turning of a global war machine. For every Japanese destroyer that risks the slot, an American convoy of fat, slow-moving merchantmen was unloading an entire regiment's worth of supplies onto the beaches of Rendova. For every bag of rice the Japanese floated ashore, American engineers were landing bulldozers and heavy artillery. While the Japanese had won the night's violent exchange, the Americans owned the day. The skies over New Georgia were filled with corsairs and dauntlesses, methodically pounding the Japanese defenses at Munda into a fine gray powder. The naval defeat at Kula Gulf was a painful and humbling lesson for the U.S. Navy, a brutal education on the lethal reality of the Longlands that would inform tactical changes for the rest of the war. But it did not halt the campaign. The siege of Munda was not broken, it was tightening with every passing hour. The naval battle had been a dramatic, bloody sortie. It had not, and could not, change the fundamental, strategic reality. The island would fall not because of a single, decisive battle, but because of the overwhelming, grinding weight of Allied material superiority. The valor and skill of the Japanese sailors in Kula Gulf had bought their comrades on shore a few more days of bitter defiance, but all they had really purchased was a slightly slower, more agonizing defeat.